Welcome to Hellenic Heritage Journeys. Here, we share the fascinating stories hidden within Greece's archaeological sites. In every episode, we take a journey through space and time, uncovering the traces of people who lived, created, and left their mark thousands of years ago. Follow the thread of history with us from yesterday to today. This episode was created in collaboration with Marketing Greece. Imagine yourself in a suburb of ancient Athens which, as the historian Thucydides tells us, lay at the northwestern edge of the city and was crossed by the River Eridanos. Even the river's name, perhaps deriving from the Homeric word Irion, meaning grave or burial mound, seems to hint that the land through which it flows carries the silence of eternity alongside the pulse of daily life. This is the ancient Attic Dymi of Kerameikos. Here, the noise of potters' workshops producing the finest vases of their time and the voices of merchants mingled with the sacred stillness of the funerary monuments of Athens' most important cemetery. The clay-rich soil along the banks of the Eridanos became art in the hands of skilled craftsmen, transformed into some of the most beautiful vessels of the ancient world. In this episode, we explore Kerameikos together, the so-called most beautiful suburb of Thucydides, where ancient Athens' great processions once began, passing between imposing burial monuments where the history of the city is engraved in marble, clay, and collective memory. The Archaeological Site of Kerameikos, covering around 45,000 square meters, represents only a small part of the ancient Dymi, or civic district of Athens, that carried the same name. Kerameikos was in fact one of the largest districts in ancient Athens. Its name reflects its own mythical origin. According to the traveler Pausanias, it was named after the hero Keramos, son of Dionysios and Ariadne. Beyond myth, however, this was indeed the district where potters and vase painters had their workshops, artisans who shaped and decorated countless ceramic objects with their hands. The choice of location was no accident. The clay-rich soil on the banks of the Eridanos provided exceptional raw material. The area was ideal for workshops to flourish, and Kerameikos developed into the most important production center for the famous Attic vases. Many were decorated in the black figure technique, in which dark silhouettes were painted onto the natural red surface of the clay and refined with details etched into the surface. Others followed the red figure technique, reversing the scheme. The background was filled in with black, leaving the figures in the color of the clay and allowing for greater subtlety and detail. They were iconic vessels that traveled throughout the ancient world. The potters and vase painters of Kerameikos had perfected their craft, producing works that today we regard as unparalleled high art. One of the site's most remarkable finds, which you can admire today in the National Archaeological Museum, is the famous Dipylon in Ochoe, a vessel of immeasurable value, as its inscription preserves the earliest known example of alphabetic Greek writing. But Kerameikos was not only a place of workshops. Within the ancient Dymi, there were homes, an urban fabric, as well as the largest cemetery of ancient Athens. A pivotal moment in the history of Kerameikos came in 478 BC. After the painful defeat of the Persians and amid fears of Spartan aggression, the Athenian statesman Themistocles ordered the urgent construction of a defensive wall around the city. The need for protection was so pressing and time so limited that even grave markers were sometimes used as building material. With the construction of this wall, Kerameikos was divided in two, inner and outer Kerameikos. The section within the walls became part of the city and was inhabited, while the area outside remained a cemetery. Today's archaeological site essentially preserves part of the cemetery, outside the city walls. Within this stretch of wall stood two of the most important gates of ancient Athens, the Dipylon, the city's largest and most central gate, and the Sacred Gate. Built close to one another, they would stand roughly along today's Melidoni Street. You can still make out parts of the two roads that passed through the gates. From the Dipylon ran the road connecting Athens to Plato's Academy, which was found outside the walls of ancient Athens. And from the Sacred Gate began the road to Eleusis, the Sacred Way. The importance of these gates is clear from the fact that two of Athens's most significant processions began here. From the Dipylon set out the splendid Panathenaic procession, which passed through the ancient agora and ended at the Acropolis carrying the sacred peplos, or ceremonial robe, for the goddess Athena. From the Sacred Gate began the mystical procession of the Eleusinian mysteries, which followed the Sacred Way to Eleusis. Outside the walls lay a particularly significant area of the cemetery, the Demosion Sima, a public burial ground for those who died in battle and for prominent Athenians. It likely extended along the entire road from the Dipylon to Plato's Academy. Indeed, the burial area of the Demosion Sima may correspond spatially to the part of Athens that today lies between Plateon and Salaminos streets, since fragments of funerary monuments from the Demosion Sima were uncovered on a plot of land between these streets at number 35 Salaminos Street. But let's return to 430 BC. In an atmosphere of deep mourning, Pericles delivered, here at the Demosion Sima, the famous Funeral Oration recorded by Thucydides, honoring the falling of the first year of the Peloponnesian War and extolling the ideals and values of Athenian democracy. Within the walls and between the two great gates stood another important building, the Pompeion, constructed at the end of the 5th century BC. This spacious rectangular complex, with a large peristyle courtyard and banquet halls, likely hosted official civic feasts in honor of Athena. It played a key role in the Panathenaea festival, serving as the preparation space for the procession and storage area for its equipment. The great courtyard could even accommodate the ceremonial ship on which Athena's sacred peplos was hung before being carried to dress her xoanon, or cult statue, in the Acropolis. The Pompeion also once housed the bronze statue of Socrates by the great sculptor Lysippos and wall paintings depicting the orator Isocrates and comic poets such as Menander. The length of use of the cemetery of Kerameikos is especially striking, beginning long before the classical splendor of 5th century Athens. The earliest burials date to the early Bronze Age, between 2700 and 2000 BC, and the cemetery remained in use until the 6th century AD. During the geometric and archaic periods, in other words, from 1000 to 480 BC, tombs increased in number. Many were grouped within burial mounds, most likely pertaining to families, and were adorned with grave monuments. In the ancient cemetery of Kerameikos, there were stone enclosures that surrounded groups of graves, known as perivoli. On their main facades often stood funerary steles and imposing monuments proclaiming the status of the deceased, while at the same time becoming masterpieces of ancient Attic sculpture. Yet luxury in funerary monuments was not always permitted in democratic Athens. Clisthenes' reforms at the end of the 6th century BC forbade extravagance on the funerary monuments of Athens. These limitations seem to have loosened during the upheaval of the Peloponnesian War, allowing large monuments to reappear, but were reinstated more strictly in 317 BC by Demetrios of Phaleron, who required simple grave markers bearing only essential details: name, father's name, and place of origin. Today, you can walk along part of a funerary road known as the Street of the Tombs. Imagine that in antiquity, this was a branch of the Sacred Way leading towards Piraeus. Even now, as you walk along the stretch that has been preserved, you can feel the weight of centuries. On either side stand significant funerary monuments. The originals are displayed in the Kerameikos Museum for protection, but faithful copies have been placed in their original position, preserving the living sense and sanctity of the site. Continuing along the Street of the Tombs, you will encounter the funerary enclosure of the Thoriki, featuring the striking stele of Dexileos. Dexileos, son of Lysanias, was one of 5 elite cavalrymen who died in battle near Corinth in 394 to 393 BC. The relief of the stele shows him as a powerful mounted youth striking down his fallen opponent. The bronze reins and spear he once held are unfortunately lost, but they would have given the monument remarkable vitality. Though the stele stood in his family tomb, Dexileos himself was likely buried in the Demosian Sima. As a war hero, his burial would have followed the honorary funerary customs of the time, which prescribed that, after the deceased was cremated, his ashes were transported from the battlefield to Athens to be laid to rest there with due honors in the Demosian Sima. Further along, the mood changes as we encounter the enclosure with the relief of 2 sisters, Dimitria and Pamphili, erected in 320 BC, shortly before the restrictions imposed by Demetrios of Phaleron. Pamphili sits while Dimitria stands beside her, their hands extending toward one another in a gesture that recalls an eternal farewell. The female figures are framed by 2 pilasters supporting a pediment, a structure that resembles the facade of an ancient temple. A defining monument of Kerameikos is the imposing marble bull from the enclosure of Dionysios of Kollytos. Carved from Pentelic marble in the 3rd quarter of the 4th century BC, it once stood atop a high base behind a small, shrine-like structure expressing the strength and status of the deceased. It is a work of exceptional artistry. Continuing along the Street of the Tombs, the site will tell you more stories of the people buried here. The next unfolds in the enclosure of Lysimachidis. There, a statue of a dog, specifically a Molossian hound, carved in 320 BC, still stands as the vigilant and faithful guardian of the tomb. Within the same enclosure, a relief dating to 340 BC transports us to what appears at first to be a familiar domestic scene. Two elderly bearded men, flanked by two women, gathered around a table laid with small loaves of bread and sweets. Yet it may in fact represent a funerary banquet, the final gathering before the journey to the underworld. As to the left of the table, a boat is depicted, carrying a bearded man whom many identify as Charon, waiting patiently to ferry the diners across the dark waters of the river Acheron. According to another interpretation, however, the monument belonged to a family of wealthy resident foreigners, ship owners who had come to Athens from the Black Sea region. In this reading, the scene relates not to the afterlife, but to the family's life and commercial activity. Perhaps the most beautiful and famous funerary stele of the classical period, dating to 400 BC, is that of Hegeso, daughter of Proxenos, found in the funerary enclosure of Korivos. Hegeso is depicted seated, her feet resting on an elegant footstool, and in a scene of both everyday and otherworldly beauty, she selects a piece of jewelry from an open jewelry box offered respectfully by her young attendant who stands facing her. The relief is now displayed in the National Archaeological Museum. Finally, in the ancient cemetery of Kerameikos, there was also the Tritopatrion, which was probably a sanctuary dedicated to the cult of the ancestral dead. And on the southern side of the Street of the Tombs, you will encounter steles of ambassadors from various Greek cities who died and were buried in Athens. All these stories lay hidden beneath the earth for thousands of years, until 1870. That was when the systematic excavation by the Archaeological Society at Athens began, and this unique archaeological site, along with everything it brought to light, was gradually revealed. Slowly, the soil that had covered the ancient remains for centuries was removed, revealing not only the stories of the people buried here, but also the story of an entire city. From 1913 onwards, the work was undertaken by the German Archaeological Institute, which continues its excavations to this day. Thanks to this long-standing research, successive layers of life and burial were brought to light. Many of the important finds can be admired today in the Kerameikos Museum, while some of the most significant are housed in the National Archaeological Museum. Kerameikos, then, is not merely a cemetery of the distant past. It is an open book of Athenian life that remains alive, with every stone and every relief telling its own story. From the potter's workshops on the banks of the Eridanos to the grand processions and the funeral oration of Pericles, this site seems to speak to us about every aspect of ancient Athens, about death and life, art and politics, aspects that have always coexisted inseparably through the centuries. And as the centuries passed, what once animated this place never sunk into oblivion. On the contrary, what happened here has remained eternally alive in memory and in history. This is where our journey comes to an end. We hope you enjoyed the story and the path we shared. If you'd like to discover more of Greece's cultural treasures, follow our channel, Hellenic Heritage Journeys on Spotify. Until next time.